Welcome to Scale Model Basics. I'm Aaron Skinner, and this time we're going to be taking a look at scribing panel lines. Now, why would we need to scribe panel lines? Well, there's three basic reasons. One is to replace detail that might have been lost during the construction process, particularly if you've had to do a lot of sanding on your model. Second is to replace raised panel lines, which you'll find on a lot of older kits. If you're building an older kit and you want modern looking recessed panel lines, then you're going to want to scribe them. And the final one is to add detail that might be missing from the model. If they missed an inspection port or a panel line that should be on the model but the manufacturer's missed it, then you're going to want to scribe those too. Now, what does scribing actually do? When you run a scribing tool across the surface of the plastic, it actually removes a little curl of plastic from that line, leaving you with a clean line on the surface of the model. As a contrast, if you take a hobby knife and you drag it across the surface of the model, like say a number 11 blade, while it may be sharp, instead of removing plastic, what it's doing is it's cutting into the plastic, and the plastic that it's displacing has to go somewhere, so it gets pushed up to the edges, leaving you with more of a raised rather than recessed panel line. It's a great technique for replacing raised detail on a model, but that's a completely different video, so we won't go there today. Whatever the reason you're scribing panel lines, the techniques you use are basically the same. Most model companies and companies that sell tools to modelers have scribers. They come in a couple of basic type designs. There are the classic pointed scribers. This one from Excel has a single point on it. You can see it there. It tapers to a nice sharp point, so it will cut into the plastic easily. And then there is this one from Flexifile that has the advantage of having 2 points on it. There's a thicker point on one end and then a finer point on the other end. This gives you a little bit more flexibility. One of the advantages of these pointed scribers is that you can use them not only to scribe panel lines, but to impress rivets in the surface of the model if that's the other thing that you need to do. Both of these are available in the Combac Hobby Store in the link below the video. If you just need to do a little scribing and you don't have one of these handy, you can take a pin vise and a needle, sewing needle, and you just want to chuck the needle into your pin vise, and you want to get it fairly far down in there because you need it to be as stiff as possible. The longer the point is, the more likely it is to bend. And that'll just give you a simple scriber with a fine point on it that you can use for a lot of basic scribing work, whether it's scribing panel lines or impressing rivets. Then there are the specialized scribers. These two from UMM I'm particularly fond of. There's this one that comes with a metal handle, and in the end you get this pointed blade or bezeled blade that comes to a fine point. This one is designed, like most of these, to be dragged across the surface and cut into it, letting the weight of the tool do most of the work. The same is true for this one. This has an even more specialized design and has a couple of different points on it. There's this curved point, which again can be dragged across the surface, cutting into it. And then there's this one that's actually designed more to go across the surface this way and cut into it. So those are the ones from UMM. Tamiya has its own with interchangeable points, so you can get slightly different finenesses, coarse grades, gauges, whatever we call it when we're talking about scribers. And you can see it has a slightly hooked point on it, very fine, but it is also designed to be dragged across the surface and cut into the plastic that way. Finally, you can use a saw like this razor saw from ASK. These, again, can be dragged across the surface, either the point or the edge of the blade, depending on what it is you're cutting into. The edge of the blade is really good for engraving lines on curved surfaces because you can go around the curve that way. This saw can also be found in the Calmback Hobby Store in the links below. Now, which ones do you want to use? Well, that depends. I actually have all of these in my toolbox, and I pull them out depending on the kind of scribing that I'm doing, and we'll see a little bit more about that when we get to the techniques. So the most important thing to consider when you're getting ready to scribe panel lines is guiding the Scriber. If you just take your Scriber and drag it across the surface, what you're going to find is it's going to be very hard, no matter how hard you try, to keep a straight line. And particularly since you're going to want to cut into that plastic more than once, you end up with a line that is what I would call not straight. So you can use a couple of different things to guide it. The first, and probably the easiest one for many people, because they probably already have this in their stash of tools, is basic tape like this Tamiya masking tape. I can place this on the surface. It produces a nice straight line. And then I can use the Scriber. We'll use this one. And when you're scribing, what you want to do is let the weight of the tool do most of the work initially, because you don't want to force it, because the more you force it, the more likely you are to go offline. And see, the masking tape's working pretty well. You can see a little bit of plastic coming off the point of the tool there. The trouble with masking tape is it is a little bit soft, and the tool will undoubtedly want to cut into the tape as you go back up and down it repeatedly, which you'll want to do when you're scribing lines. That tape is just going to get a little deteriorated along the edge, and you're going to end up with a line that may not be as straight as you want it to. But you can see with repeated cuts, I have produced a fairly good engraved panel line there, but it's just not still quite as straight as I would like it to be. So instead, I recommend using Dymo label tape. It's from the old label makers where you would use it to push numbers into it. It would turn white. The advantage of this is it's still flexible like tape, it's thicker, and it's adhesive. So I'm going to cut off a piece here, and we'll demonstrate on the painted plastic first so you can see it. The hardest part about this stuff is getting the backing off, because it tends to be a little bit sticky, as you can tell. Once you get it started, then you can peel it off, and then you can put this onto the surface and just press it into place. And now you have, as you can tell, a good edge on there. So again, just drag the tool. Don't force it. Just drag it across repeatedly. And as you do that, you're going to cut a deeper and deeper line. There's a nice little piece of plastic coming off there. Nice and curly. Again, and each time you do this, you can see you're removing just a little bit more plastic. So as you run it along the surface, it cuts just a little deeper and a little deeper. But as you do that, ultimately you should be able to pull this up, and you have a nice straight engraved panel line. Now, one of the advantages of this is it is reusable. So I can use this on this. This is the wing from a monogram Kingfisher, OS2U. Just place it along the panel line that you want to engrave. Make sure you get it lined up, because if it goes on crooked and you cut crooked, you're never going to be able to get it back. And then, same thing. You can just run it along that surface. Don't press. Just let the tool do its work. Just try a different tool. And ultimately, you end up with an engraved panel line where the raised panel line was. Again, because this is flexible, you can do the same thing on a curve, like this curve on the fuselage. You can tell it's still sticky. This stuff will remain sticky for a long time. So you can just keep using it. Put it along the existing panel line, and then I can use the Scriber. Same technique as before, just around the edge. And this is another example where the saw might be useful, because I can place it along the edge and just let the edge guide it as I pull it back and forth along that line, and it will gradually cut a panel line where the raised panel line is. So metal straight edges like rulers can be useful, but they tend to be a little too thick and very hard to position on the surface of a model. So instead, what I like to use is the edge of a photo etch metal fret from a kit that I've already built. You can see that you have a nice straight edge on here. It's flexible, so it will go around curves, but it forms a nice hard edge for the scribing tool to follow. So I put a little tape on it, but keep the edge where it needs to be. And then you can just position the edge. And yes, you can see it's taking me a little bit of time, but this is one of those things where patience is your best thing to do to make sure you don't make mistakes. All right, and then again, I can use the saw. That metal will form a good guide, and I can just do this. Or I can use the Scriber. And ultimately, again, you end up with a recessed panel line where the raised line is. On this kit, I'm leaving the raised lines in place to serve as a guide for the edges as I'm putting them in, and then I will go through and sand down the raised panel lines once all the engraved lines are there. If you need to do strange shapes like circles or ovals, that kind of thing that are common on inspection ports or something for an aircraft, you can use these templates. These are photo etch metal templates. You can find them from a lot of manufacturers, and they come with a variety of shapes and sizes. Again, very similar to what you do with the piece of PE earlier. I'm going to tape it in place. Around the object I'm using. This photo etch is thin, so it can go around curves. You just want to make sure it's secure on the surface of the model. And then you can take your tool, and it's just a matter of very lightly tracing around the template several times. Again, don't press hard. The secret here is a light touch and repeated passes. And then what you should end up with when you peel up the tape is a nicely engraved oval, which is perfect for certain types of shapes on a model. So one of the most difficult kinds of panel lines that you'll need to replace are those along seams like the fuselage halves on this Spitfire. There are panel lines that run across it, but they've been eliminated by sanding, especially here on the underside. So this is where the saw comes into its own. In certain cases, if there's just enough of the line left, all you really need to do is place the edge of the blade into the existing panel line, and then you can just rock it back and forth along that panel line, and all you're doing is deepening what little of it is left to restore it to what it looked like before you sanded. Now, if you absolutely want to be sure that you're getting it perfectly aligned, this is, again, the Dymo tape is useful here. You can place it along that panel line, tape it in place, or stick it in place. like so. And then again, use the saw to just rock it back and forth along that tape edge and restore the panel line. So you get a nice panel line right there. It definitely looks like it's there, so it'll show up under paint and it will take a wash later. So I've demonstrated all of these techniques on plastic, obviously one of the most common materials we use in modeling. The same techniques can be used on other materials. Resin's a good example. It will work on resin, but you need to be just a touch careful because the resin can be a little brittle and it can chip if you're not careful, if you put too much pressure on it with the Scriber, and it may give you a slightly rough edge to the line you're trying to scribe. You can also use it on metal. The one caveat I would say is don't use the tools you're using on plastic and resin on metal. Metal's more likely to dull those tools, and then you turn around and use that same slightly dull tool on plastic, you're not going to get the results you're looking for. I think that about wraps it up for scribing. Thanks for watching. I'm Aaron Skinner. We'll see you next time.